Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're doing something a bit special, part of our CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series. We're jumping into some multi-choice questions, the kind designed to really sharpen your knowledge for that CSWIP 3.1 Welding Inspector Exam. So whether you're hitting the books hard right now or maybe just really curious about the precision involved in welding inspection, you're definitely in the right place. We're going to run through each question, look at the options, and really unpack the why behind the correct answers. Okay, let's unpack this.
Absolutely. And it's so important to get that these questions, while they're not just about memorizing facts, what's fascinating here is that each question really taps into a fundamental principle of welding or inspection. Understanding that is key.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so let's kick things off. First question. This one looks at how seemingly small choices impact the weld itself. Question 1. A multi-pass manual metal arc MMA butt weld made on carbon steel consists of 5 passes deposited using a 6 millimeter diameter electrode. A 12-pass weld made on the same joint deposited using a 4 millimeter diameter electrode on the same material will have. And the options are A, a lower heat input and a higher degree of grain refinement. B, a lower heat input and a coarse grain structure. C, a lower amount of distortion and a higher degree of grain refinement. D, a higher amount of distortion and a lower degree of grain refinement. This one really makes you think about those ripple effects within the metal, doesn't it? What are we really looking at here?
Okay, so the correct statement here, the one that really nails the primary effect, is A, a lower heat input and a higher degree of grain refinement. Let's break that down a bit. When you switch from a bigger 6 mil electrode to a smaller 4 mil one, you're generally going to use, less current, less voltage for each pass. That straight away means lower heat input per pass.
Right. Less energy going in each time.
Exactly. Now add to that, you're doing 12 passes instead of just 5 to fill the same joint. So you're spreading the total heat out over more cycles, and each pass kind of heat treats the one underneath it.
Like a mini heat treatment cycle.
Precisely. This repeated heating and cooling, especially with that lower heat input for each individual pass, it encourages what we call grain refinement. Basically, the grains in the weld metal and the HAZ, the heat-affected zone, they don't get a chance to grow too large. They get refined, smaller, and a finer grain structure. Well, that usually means better mechanical properties. Think better toughness, better strength.
Okay, that makes sense for A. But what about the others, like B, suggesting a coarse grain structure? That seems wrong now.
Yeah, B is sort of the opposite of what happens. Coarse grains usually come from higher heat input, letting them grow bigger, or maybe not enough of those refining thermal cycles. Lower heat input, more passes that points away from coarse grains, and options C and D bring in distortion. Now, lower heat can help reduce distortion, that's true, but doing more passes, 12 instead of 5, means more cycles of heating and cooling, more cumulative shrinkage. So the effect on distortion can be a bit more complex. It's not as direct a consequence as the heat input and grain refinement. So A is really the most direct metallurgical outcome described.
Got it. So for you as an inspector, understanding this link, electrode size, passes, heat input, grain structure, it's absolutely crucial. It's about the weld's guts, not just the surface look. All right, let's shift gears a little. Let's think about the material itself dictating the process. Aluminium, for example. Question 2. Which of the following welding processes are commonly used for the welding of aluminium? Options. A, MIG and TIG. B, MAG and TIG. C, MMA and TIG. D, MMA and MIG.
Aluminium, yeah, it's got its own personality, doesn't it? You can't just weld it like steel. What's the deal there?
Exactly right. It's quite particular, and the most common, most effective processes are definitely A, MIG and TIG, metal inert gas, and tungsten inert gas. The reason these two are the go-tos is, well, they handle aluminium's main challenges. That super fast oxidation and its high thermal conductivity. It just soaks up heat.
Okay, tell me about TIG first. Why is that good for aluminium?
Well, TIG, or GTAW, gives you amazing control. Really precise heat input, which you absolutely need with aluminium because it conducts heat so well, it can easily warp or just melt away if you're not careful. And, crucially, TIG uses an inert gas shield, usually pure argon. That's non-negotiable. Aluminium forms this tough oxide skin almost instantly in air. This oxide melts at a much higher temperature than the aluminium itself, so you need to deal with it. TIG, especially with AC current, has a cleaning action that helps break up that oxide. Perfect for thin stuff, high-quality joints.
Okay, precision and oxide cleaning was TIG. What about MIG?
MIG, or GMAW, is generally faster, higher deposition rates, so it's often used for thicker aluminium sections, maybe more production-focused work. Like TIG, it absolutely must use an inert gas shield, again, usually argon, to keep oxygen away from the molten pool. And with MIG on aluminium, you often use things like pulse MIG. It gives you better control over the arc and heat, helps avoid problems like porosity or burning right through the material, which can happen easily with aluminium.
So if MIG and TIG are the answers, why not the others? What's wrong with trying MMA, for instance?
MMA, or stick welding, yeah, that's really difficult with aluminium.
Yeah.
Not generally recommended. The big problem is that oxide layer again. Standard MMA electrode fluxes just aren't great at removing it effectively and providing consistent shielding. Plus, many MMA electrodes have moisture in the coating, which releases hydrogen, and aluminium is very susceptible to hydrogen porosity. That weakens the weld badly.
Okay, so MMA's out. What about mag welding in option B?
Mag, metal, active gas. The clue's in the name. Active gas, like CO2 or a mix. These gases work fine for steel, but they would actually react with the aluminium. Chemically react. You'd get terrible oxidation, loads of defects, just completely unsuitable. It really drives home how vital that inert gas shield is for aluminium.
Wow, yeah. It really underlines that process choice isn't just like personal preference. It's dictated by the material science itself. If you're working with aluminium, it's pretty much got to be MIG or TIG. Okay, so we know how to choose a process for material. Now, how do we check the quality afterwards without, breaking the thing? Let's talk NDT. Question 3, NDT, nice and simple, options dot. MPI can only detect surface breaking defects of B. DPI can only detect surface breaking defects at C. UT can only detect surface breaking defects at D. Both A and B are correct statements. All right, finding flaws without destruction. Which of these methods is strictly limited to seeing what's right on the surface?
The correct statement here, the one that's accurately describing a limitation, is B. DPI can only detect surface breaking defects. DPI, dye penetrant inspection, or liquid penetrant. It works exactly how it sounds. A liquid dye, the penetrant, seeps into any cracks or flaws that are open to the surface. Capillary action pulls it in. Then you clean off the excess and apply a developer, which draws the dye back out of the flaw, making it visible. If the flaw isn't open to the surface, the dye just can't get in. Simple as that.
Makes sense. So DPI is surface only. Why aren't MPI and UT limited in the same way then? What's different about them?
Okay, let's take MPI magnetic particle inspection. MPI is actually a bit more capable. It can find both surface-breaking defects and defects that are just below the surface, near-surface defects. It works by setting up a magnetic field in the part, assuming it's ferromagnetic, like steel. Flaws disrupt this field, creating what's called a leakage field. Magnetic particles sprayed on the surface gather at these leakage points. Because the magnetic field goes slightly into the material, it can pick up those flaws that aren't quite open to the surface but are close.
Okay, so MPI does surface and near surface. What about UT?
UT, ultrasonic testing. That's a whole different approach. UT uses sound waves, high-frequency sound waves, sent into the material. These waves travel through the material and bounce back or reflect off any discontinuities, things like cracks, voids, inclusions. It doesn't matter if they're on the surface or buried deep inside. By analyzing those reflected sound waves, the echoes, you can find and size flaws pretty accurately, both surface and critically subsurface. It's very versatile for finding internal problems.
Right. And this really highlights something crucial, doesn't it? You absolutely have to know the limits of each NDT method. If you suspect an internal lamination, using DPI is pointless. It just won't see it. You need something like UT. Choosing the right tool for the specific job for the type of flaw you might expect is critical for the inspector.
Exactly. You match the method to the expected defect and location.
Okay, so finding defects is vital. But how do we make sure the whole welding process is set up correctly before we even start welding? Which leads us to procedure qualification. Question 4. The main reason for qualifying a welding procedure is your options. A, determine the welder's ability. B, check whether the acceptance criteria specific to the project can be met. C, to show that the fabricator has good welding control. 2, to show the welded joints meet the requirements of the specification. We put a lot of effort into qualifying procedures. All that testing, documentation. What's the fundamental point? What are we really trying to achieve?
The main reason, the core purpose, is D, to show the welded joints meet the requirements of the specification. Let me unpack that. A welding procedure qualification, or WPQ, it's basically about proving that a specific recipe for welding works. That means a defined combination, the material, the joint design, the process, like TIG or MMA, the specific filler wire or electrode, any preheat, any post-weld heat treatment, the whole package. You prove that if you follow that exact recipe, you will consistently get a weld that meets all the necessary standards.
Standards set by codes or the project itself?
Exactly. Codes, engineering standards, project specifications. It's about demonstrating, through testing, that the procedure can reliably produce welds with the required mechanical properties, strength, toughness, and the required level of soundness, meaning freedom from unacceptable defects.
Yeah.
It proves the process is capable.
Okay, that's clear.
Right.
But option A mentions the welder's ability. That's important too, right? Why isn't that the main reason?
That's a really common point of confusion. Determining the welder's ability, option A, is absolutely vital, but that's the job of welder qualification testing. That's a separate thing. Think of it like this. The procedure qualification, WPQ, proves the recipe is good. The welder qualification proves the individual cook can follow that recipe correctly. You need both, but the WPQ establishes the baseline method first.
Gotcha. Recipe first, then the cook. What about B and C?
Well, option B, meeting project acceptance criteria. Yes, the qualified procedure needs to ensure that, but meeting the specification, option D, is broader. It covers all requirements, not just the initial checks. So D is more comprehensive. And C, showing the fabricator has good control, that's more of a result of using qualified procedures and qualified welders. Having those things demonstrates good control, but the reason you qualify the procedure in the first place is to prove it meets the spec.
Okay, so the qualified procedure is like the guaranteed blueprint. It ensures the weld, if done correctly, will perform as needed. It's the foundation for quality control.
Precisely. It provides confidence and repeatability.
All right, let's do one more. Let's talk about a specific, very common welding consumable. Question 5, E6013R. Options are A, would most probably be used for welding low-pressure pipework. B, would most probably be used for welding high-pressure pipework.
Yeah.
C, are used in the vertical down welding position on storage tanks.
Wow.
D, are used in a situation where low hydrogen welds are specified. The E6013 electrode, a real workhorse. You see it everywhere. What's its main gig? Where does it shine?
Ah, the 6013, yeah, classic rutile electrode. The best fit here is most probable use described in these options is A, weld in low-pressure pipework. Why? Well, E6013s are known for being really user-friendly. They have a soft, smooth arc, not much spatter, and the slag practically peels itself off. They produce a nice-looking weld bead, too. Because of this ease of use, they're great for general fabrication, sheet metal repairs, situations where you need a decent weld, but maybe not top-tier mechanical properties or low hydrogen performance. Low-pressure pipework fits that bill perfectly. Ease of use and good appearance are often key there.
Makes sense. Easy to use, looks good, fine for less demanding jobs. So why not the other options? High-pressure pipework.
Definitely not. B, high-pressure pipework. Those jobs demand high strength, high toughness, and critically low hydrogen weld metal to avoid cracking risks. That's where you'd use something like an E7ZU18, a low hydrogen electrode. A 6013 just doesn't have the required properties or the low hydrogen characteristics needed for that kind of critical application. Big safety implications there.
Okay, no high pressure. What about C, vertical down on storage tanks?
Well, E6013s can be used for vertical down welding. They actually run quite nicely downhill because the slag freezes quickly and supports the puddle. But is it their most probable general use case, especially specifying storage tanks? Probably not. The question asks what they'd most probably be used for, and that points more towards general, less critical fabrication like low-pressure pipe. Option A is a better description of its typical domain.
Right, it can do it, but it's not its defining role. And finally, option D, low hydrogen specified.
Absolutely not. That's definitively wrong. E6013 is a rutile electrode, and these inherently have more moisture, more hydrogen potential in their coating compared to basic low hydrogen electrodes like the E7Z18. Using a 6013 where low hydrogen is specified is asking for trouble, specifically hydrogen-induced cracking, especially on thicker or higher strength materials. So D is incorrect.
It really does circle back to matching the tool, the electrode in this case, to the specific demands of the job, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing your consumables, what they do well, and just as importantly, what they don't do or where they shouldn't be used, that's fundamental stuff for an inspector.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's all about suitability for service.
And just like that, we've worked through these CSWIP 3.1 style questions. We touched on heat input effects, welding aluminium, the limits of NDT methods, why we qualify procedures, and even a specific electrode type. The aim here was really to give you those insights, those aha moments that hopefully make this stuff stick a bit better than just reading a textbook. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, and maybe it leaves you with a thought to chew on. How does understanding each of these specific points, heat input, process choice, NDT limits, procedure rules, consumables, how does it all fit together? How does knowing all this collectively allow us as inspectors or engineers to ensure safety and integrity in literally every single weld that holds our world together? It's much bigger than just exam answers, you know?
That's a great final thought. Keep digging into these concepts. Keep asking why. Keep connecting the dots. Because understanding this isn't just about passing the test, it's about building a safer world. We hope you found this useful, and we look forward to having you back for our next deep dive.